The air of Paris seemed thick, its ever-present fog hanging heavy over the banks of the Seine, almost suffocating the city beneath a blanket of damp uncertainty. Inspector Jules-Aimé Maigret stood beneath a gas lamp, its flickering yellow light casting long shadows against the cobblestones, reflecting the confusion that had taken root within his mind. The city was always so alive, yet tonight it felt eerily still. A man had been found dead. Not in the usual way, not by violence or some tragic accident, but by something far stranger, far more elusive, a death that had been predicted, a man who had watched his own demise unfold. How could one die when they had already seen it coming? How could one leave the world and remain still, like the shadow that lingers long after the body is gone? These questions gnawed at Maigret, pulling him deeper into the tangled web of Parisian intrigue. And as he began to walk towards the precinct, the weight of his doubts settled on him, more suffocating than the fog that now seemed to suffuse the very streets he walked. Before he could answer the questions of fate and death, Maigret knew one thing: this case would consume him. But as always, answers are hard to find when one has not even asked the right question. If you're as intrigued as Maigret himself, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow his every move as the mystery unfolds. We'll journey through the shadowy streets, unraveling secrets that have long been buried. The rain had fallen since morning, a slow, relentless drizzle that turned the streets of Paris into mirrors of shadow and light. From the window of his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Maigret watched the blurred silhouettes move across the square below, men in heavy coats, women clutching umbrellas that bent against the wind, carriages swaying as they crossed the wet cobblestones. There was a rhythm to the city in the rain, a kind of melancholy music that only those who listened closely could hear. Maigret lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl in the dim air, the scent mingling with damp tobacco and paper. He had not yet decided whether the man who stood across from his desk was mad or terrified, perhaps both. Etienne Leclerc was small and wiry, his hands trembling as though some invisible current passed through them. His face, pale and waxy, carried the expression of someone who had long ceased to sleep. His eyes, dark, ringed with exhaustion, darted between Maigret and the window, as if searching for something only he could see. "I will be dead before the week is out, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," Leclerc said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper. Maigret said nothing. He drew on his pipe, the ember glowing briefly in the half-light, and exhaled slowly. He had heard every manner of confession, from murderers boasting of their crimes to beggars claiming divine punishment. But something about Leclerc's tone, the quiet conviction, made him pause. "And who is it?" Maigret asked softly. "Who intends to kill you?" Leclerc shook his head. "No one. Not in the way you mean. It isn't a man, it's something decided." He pressed a hand to his chest as if to steady the beat of his heart. "I've seen it happen. I've seen my own death." A faint murmur rose from the corridor beyond the door. Rain tapped gently against the glass, the sound almost like a clock ticking in a silent room. Maigret leaned back in his chair, watching the man carefully. "You're certain of this vision?" he asked. "A dream, perhaps? A trick of the mind?" "It was not a dream," Leclerc said. "I saw the exact moment, the room, the time of day." The curtains were drawn. The clock on the mantel showed 10 minutes past 2. I was lying in my chair, just there, in my apartment on Rue du Temple. And I was dead. The words hung in the air like the lingering echo of a prayer. For a long moment, Maigret said nothing. He knew better than to dismiss such claims outright. Men who believed themselves doomed often brought about their own fate in one way or another. "You've been ill?" he asked at last. "Overworked, perhaps?" Leclerc smiled faintly, a ghost of amusement in his expression. "You don't believe me, Inspector? That's all right. I didn't expect you to." Maigret sighed. "Tell me, then. What do you expect me to do?" "Nothing," Leclerc said simply. "I only wanted someone to know, so that when it happens, there will be one man who remembers that I told the truth." When the man left, Maigret sat for a long while, staring at the faint impression his visitor's damp hat had left on the chair. The office felt suddenly colder. He turned to the window. The rain had grown heavier, the streets below shrouded in mist. Somewhere a bell rang, distant, muffled, uncertain. Maigret tamped the ashes from his pipe and muttered to himself. He's frightened of something or someone. It was 2 days later when the telegram arrived. "Man found dead in apartment Rue du Temple. Stop. No signs of struggle. Stop. Possible suicide. Stop." Maigret stared at the words as the pipe smoke coiled above the desk. A strange heaviness filled his chest, the sense that the inevitable had unfolded exactly as foretold. He took his coat, his hat, and made his way into the rain. The apartment was small, tidy, and very still. The smell of old tobacco and damp fabric lingered in the air. Etienne Leclerc sat in his armchair, as if asleep. The curtains were drawn. The clock on the mantel showed 10 minutes past 2. Janvier, one of Maigret's most reliable inspectors, met him at the door. "No sign of a struggle, Chief. Door locked from the inside. Windows bolted. Doctor says heart failure." "Heart failure," Maigret repeated quietly. He moved through the room, noting the small details. A half-empty glass of wine on the table, a book open beside it, and a folded envelope resting on the mantelpiece. The handwriting on it was neat, deliberate. It was addressed simply to Inspector Maigret. He opened it slowly. Inside, only one line was written. "You see, I told you." For a long while, Maigret stood in silence. Outside, the city carried on, carriages clattering, voices echoing through the rain. But within that small room, time seemed to have stopped. Later, when he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret poured himself a small glass of brandy and sat by the window once more. He replayed every word Leclerc had said. Men died every day in Paris, by knife, by pistol, by their own despair. But there was something in this death that disturbed him more than the rest. It wasn't the manner of it, nor the mystery of how it had happened, but the quiet acceptance that preceded it. Leclerc hadn't feared death. He had been waiting for it, expecting it, as though it were an appointment that could not be postponed. Lucas entered the office, shaking rain from his hat. "The coroner confirms natural causes," he said. "No poison, no sign of foul play, just stopped breathing." Maigret nodded slowly. "And yet," he murmured, he knew. 2 days before it happened, he knew. Lucas frowned. Maybe he was ill. Maybe he felt something coming on. "Perhaps," Maigret said, but there was doubt in his tone. He leaned back, his eyes unfocused, as if watching the faint trails of smoke unravel in the air. "But there's something I don't understand. Why come to me? Why make it official? What was he afraid of?" Lucas shrugged. "Some men fear their own thoughts, Chief." Maigret smiled faintly. "And some men fear what they've seen." That night, long after the building had emptied, Maigret remained at his desk. The rain had stopped, but the city's mist clung to the windows. He took the letter again, turning it over in his hand. The paper was ordinary, the ink slightly smudged, but the words seemed to carry a strange weight. He thought of Leclerc sitting there in his chair, watching the clock tick toward its appointed hour. What had he seen that made him so certain? A vision? A warning? Or had someone convinced him of his own death? In the silence, Maigret heard the faint echo of his own thoughts. "You see, I told you." He reached for his pipe, but his hand paused in mid-air. Something tugged at the corner of his mind. A detail, small but sharp. The curtains had been drawn, yes, but how had the room been so dark at that hour? The clock showed 2 in the afternoon. There should have been daylight seeping through the edges. Why, then, were they closed? He stood and looked out over Paris, where the last of the fog was lifting from the river. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a bell tolled again, distant, uncertain, almost sorrowful. He thought of Leclerc's voice, trembling but sure. "It's something decided." Maigret whispered to himself, "If it was decided, then someone decided it." He stubbed out his pipe, took his hat, and turned toward the door. The case of Etienne Leclerc was only beginning. The next morning dawned grey, with a chill that clung to the bones like regret. The Seine moved sluggishly beneath the bridges, its surface rippling with faint reflections of early light and passing carriages. Maigret stood outside the building on Rue du Temple, collar turned up, eyes fixed on the narrow doorway that led to Etienne Leclerc's apartment. The neighbours had already begun to whisper. They always did when death came quietly. Madame Fournier, who lived on the floor below, had seen Leclerc 2 nights before his death. "He was pale as linen," she told Maigret, clutching her shawl as if the mere memory of the man chilled her. "Said he wasn't sleeping, said he felt watched. I told him to see a doctor, but he just smiled that strange little smile of his and said, 'It's already too late, madame.'" Her words drifted through Maigret's mind as he stepped once more into the dead man's flat. The air was stale, faintly metallic, as if fear had a scent of its own. The curtains had been opened by the men who came before, yet even in daylight the place felt dim, the corners heavy with silence. He examined the armchair where Leclerc had been found, tracing the worn fabric with his fingertips. It was not a rich man's home. The furniture was old, though well kept, and the few decorations. A clock, a faded photograph, a glass vase with dried flowers, seemed to belong to another era. But on the small writing desk near the window, Maigret noticed something new. An open notebook half filled with cramped handwriting. He turned the pages carefully. At first, they were filled with numbers, dates, times, addresses. Then gradually, words began to replace them. Fragments of thoughts, unfinished sentences, and one recurring line that appeared again and again. "I hear the footsteps at night." A sound broke the stillness, the faint creak of the stair outside. Maigret looked up. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "We found the building concierge, Chief. Says Leclerc received a visitor 3 nights ago." "Who?" "Didn't catch the name. A man, tall in a dark coat. Came after dusk, left before midnight. Concierge remembers him because he carried no umbrella, and it was pouring that night." Maigret nodded slowly. "And no one else?" "No one. Leclerc kept to himself, lived off some small inheritance, did bookkeeping for a firm that folded years ago. Neighbours say he spoke little, mostly walked by the river in the evenings." The inspector closed the notebook. "And the river," he murmured, "keeps its secrets." Outside, the day had thickened into a fine drizzle. Maigret walked along the embankment toward the Pont Notre-Dame, his thoughts as restless as the water below. The image of Leclerc, sitting alone, convinced of his own death, would not leave him. The man had not been hysterical or raving. He had been resigned, and that, to Maigret, was far worse. He stopped near a cafe that overlooked the river, the kind of place where clerks and dock workers came for cheap wine and warmth. Inside, The air smelled of tobacco and strong coffee. The barman recognized Maigret at once and nodded respectfully. "Inspector. A bad business, that one on Rue du Temple." "You knew him?" Maigret asked, taking a seat at the counter. The man wiped a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "Leclerc? He came here often. Sat by the window, always the same table. Quiet man. Never caused trouble. Lately, though, well, he'd changed." "In what way?" "He'd sit there for hours without touching his drink, kept watching the door as if waiting for someone. Once I asked if he was all right, and he said, 'You'll understand soon enough.' Gave me the chills, that one." Maigret stirred his coffee, eyes fixed on the steam curling upward. "Did he ever meet anyone here? Anyone particular?" The barman thought for a moment. "Once, maybe twice. A tall fellow, foreign-looking, didn't speak much, paid in cash. They'd talk quietly, then go their separate ways. Last time was just a few days before the poor man died." When Maigret left the café, the fog had thickened, swallowing the riverbank in pale grey folds. Somewhere across the water, a tugboat's horn moaned low and mournful. He buttoned his coat and turned up the street, his thoughts circling back to that mysterious visitor, a man who arrived without an umbrella on a stormy night, who left behind no name, no trace. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the air was heavy with the usual mix of cigarette smoke and damp wool. Janvier sat at his desk, going through reports. "We've checked Leclerc's background," he said when Maigret entered. "No debts, no enemies, no family. Only a cousin in Rouen, says they haven't spoken in years." Maigret poured himself a small cup of lukewarm coffee and stared at the map of Paris pinned to the wall. "A man with no enemies rarely fears death," he said quietly, "unless the enemy is himself." Janvier raised an eyebrow. "You think he killed himself, then?" Maigret shook his head. "No. A man who plans to end his life doesn't write to the police first. No, he was afraid of something real. He just didn't have the words for it." He walked to the window, watching the carriages cross the bridge in the distance. "Find out if anyone's reported strange occurrences in that area, disturbances, threats, anything unusual, and see if any of the cafés near the Rue du Temple keep records of visitors. Someone might have seen our foreigner." By nightfall, a soft rain had begun again, drumming against the office window. Maigret sat alone, reviewing the coroner's report. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, no poison, no trauma. But there was one note that caught his eye. Facial muscles fixed in an expression of surprise. It wasn't fear. Not quite. More like the astonishment of a man who sees something he cannot explain. That night, as he walked home along Boulevard Saint-Germain, Maigret felt the weight of the city pressing in around him. Every doorway seemed to hold a shadow, every passing face another story untold. He thought again of Leclerc's words, "I've seen my own death," and wondered whether the man had seen something true, or merely believed it until it became so. A gust of wind rattled the gas lamps along the street. Somewhere a carriage wheel splashed through a puddle. He stopped beneath the awning of a tobacconist's and struck a match, the flame flickering against the damp air as he lit his pipe. The smoke curled upward, pale against the darkness, and he murmured, "If the past whispers long enough, even the living begin to listen." In the glow of the match, he caught sight of a figure across the street, tall, motionless, watching. Then, as quickly as he noticed it, the figure turned and vanished into the mist. Maigret stood very still. The sound of the rain returned, steady and unbroken, but something within him shifted. The city's pulse had changed. He knocked the ashes from his pipe and turned toward home, his mind already forming the first quiet suspicion. Etienne Leclerc had not been the first to hear those footsteps in the night, and he would not be the last. The following evening, the city seemed to hold its breath. The rain had stopped, yet the streets of Paris still glistened beneath the faint orange glow of the gas lamps, each puddle reflecting fragments of an unseen world. Maigret moved through the mist with his collar turned high, his heavy overcoat brushing against his knees. The Rue du Temple felt deserted, its usual noise replaced by the low hum of distant carriages and the occasional echo of footsteps that didn't always seem to belong to him. He had returned not because there was more to see, but because the silence of that apartment had followed him. It clung to his thoughts, intruding on his sleep. Leclerc's face, pale, calm, and faintly astonished, kept appearing in the dark behind his eyes. There were too many unanswered questions. Why had the man been so certain of his death? And who was the tall visitor without the umbrella? Inside the building, the stairwell smelled of damp stone and boiled cabbage. The concierge's lodge light flickered weakly as Maigret entered. Madame Jouvet, a woman with a face as sharp as her tongue, looked up from her knitting. "Back again, Inspector?" she asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "For a moment," he said. "You told my men you'd seen a man visit Monsieur Leclerc?" She pursed her lips, thinking. "Oui, a tall man, dark coat, didn't look local. He spoke quietly. Foreign, maybe Belgian or Swiss. He didn't give his name, but Leclerc seemed to know him. He'd been waiting for him all evening, pacing up and down the stairs like a caged cat." "Did you hear what they spoke about?" She gave a small snort. "Walls in this place hear everything, Inspector, but even walls can't make out whispers." Maigret nodded, thanked her, and climbed the steps slowly. The building was old, its timbers creaking with every movement. When he reached Leclerc's floor, he stood outside the door for a long moment, listening. The corridor was dark except for the dim light of the stairwell. Somewhere above, a clock chimed 9 times. He turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was just as he remembered, the faint scent of tobacco, the worn chair, the folded letter still lying where he had last placed it. He walked toward the window and looked out. Across the street, the opposite building loomed like a dark silhouette, its windows shuttered tight. But one window, a small, square one near the corner, was open just a crack. He stood there for a while, pipe in hand, until he caught the faintest movement, a curtain twitching, a shadow pulling back. Someone was watching. The next day, at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret called in Janvier. "I want that window watched, building opposite Rue du Temple, discreetly." Whoever's behind those shutters was keeping an eye on Leclerc, and maybe on me. Janvier nodded. "Understood, Chief." As the younger man left, Maigret leaned back and stared at the map of the city on the wall. The case felt less like an investigation and more like a dream in which each clue dissolved before he could grasp it. He thought of the notebook, the line repeated over and over. "I hear the footsteps at night." That evening, a report arrived from Janvier. The man in the opposite building had been observed leaving shortly after dusk, walking west toward Boulevard de Sébastopol. He wore a black overcoat and carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Janvier had followed him as far as the corner of Rue de Cléry, where the man entered a modest hotel, the Hôtel Saint-Roch. He rented a room under the name Henri van Dalen, a Dutch name. The clerk at the hotel described him as polite, reserved and solitary. Paid for 3 nights in advance. No luggage. Maigret finished reading and sat in silence for a long time. Then just before midnight, he took his coat and set out into the damp streets again. The Hôtel Saint-Roch was one of those quiet establishments tucked between two taller buildings, its faded sign half swallowed by ivy. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and old dust. The night clerk was a young man with a thin moustache who looked nervous when Maigret showed his badge. "Monsieur Van Dalen?" he repeated. "Yes, he's here. Room 14, hasn't gone out tonight." "Don't announce me," Maigret said. He climbed the narrow staircase, the boards creaking underfoot. The corridor was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that flickered against the walls. He stopped before room 14 and listened. No sound. He knocked once. Silence. Then again. A voice answered, soft but clear. "Who is it?" "Police, Inspector Maigret." There was a pause, then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened just enough to reveal a man in his late 30s, tall, well-groomed, with sharp features and eyes that seemed both intelligent and weary. "Yes? Henri Van Dalen?" The man smiled faintly. "That is the name under which I am registered." Maigret took a slow breath. "You visited Etienne Leclerc 2 nights before his death." Another pause, almost imperceptible. "I did." "Why?" "To say goodbye." "To whom?" "To a man who no longer believed in life," Van Dalen replied, his tone calm but distant. "I knew him years ago before everything changed." "What changed?" "Reality," the man said simply, as if that explained it all. Maigret studied him carefully. There was something unnerving about his composure. The hands were steady, the gaze unwavering. "Leclerc told people he knew he was going to die. Did you tell him that?" Van Dalen looked toward the window where the city's faint glow seeped through the curtains. He already knew. Some men feel death approaching like a familiar visitor. I merely reminded him that resistance is useless. "You make it sound like a philosophy," Maigret said dryly. "Perhaps it is." The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the window pane. Maigret stepped closer. "What are you really doing in Paris, Monsieur Van Dalen?" The man smiled again, this time without warmth. "Observing. That is all I ever do." "Observing whom?" "Those who believe they can hide from what they've already invited." Before Maigret could reply, Van Dalen's gaze shifted toward something unseen beyond the inspector's shoulder. His voice dropped. "You should be careful, Inspector. Some things are better left unexplored." It was not a threat, yet it felt heavier than one. Maigret's hand twitched toward his pocket, where his revolver rested, but he didn't draw it. "You'll stay in Paris," he said finally. "We'll be speaking again." "I'm sure we will," Van Dalen murmured. As Maigret descended the stairs, he felt the strange sensation of being followed, not by footsteps, but by thought itself, as though the very air had remembered their conversation. Outside, the night was utterly still. He turned up his collar and began walking back toward the river. From one of the upper windows of the hotel, a figure watched him leave, unmoving, until his silhouette disappeared into the fog. By the time dawn crept into the city, Paris had dissolved into a pale haze that blurred the edges of everything. The streets, slick with dew, glimmered faintly beneath the gaslights that had yet to be extinguished. Maigret awoke to the sound of distant bells and the faint creak of floorboards above his apartment. For a brief moment, he lay still, listening to the rhythm of the city waking, the carriages rattling, the faint murmur of the Seine. Then he rose, buttoned his coat, and made his way toward the Quai des Orfèvres. When he entered the office, Lucas was already there, hunched over a small stack of reports, his pipe clenched between his teeth. He looked up with that familiar half-grimace of fatigue. "The hotel clerk called early this morning," he said. "Our man, Van Dalen, checked out just after 4. Paid in cash, left nothing behind. Maigret stopped mid-step. Where did he go? Nowhere we can trace, Lucas replied. No trains listed under the name, no hired carriage. It's as though he stepped into the mist and vanished. The inspector moved toward the window where the faint light of morning fell through streaks of condensation. He told me he was only observing, Maigret murmured. Perhaps he's found something new to observe. He turned back to Lucas. Have Janvier check the ports. If he's foreign, he might try to leave through Le Havre or Calais. Quietly. Lucas nodded. And Leclerc's notebook? Maigret glanced at the small leather-bound book on his desk. He'd been reading it late into the night, turning over each cryptic line. It was the writing of a man on the edge of revelation or madness. The entries had become more erratic toward the end, filled with strange references. The steps are nearer now. The visitor stands where the fog thickens. The bell will toll twice. Every line feels like a riddle, Maigret said, tapping the cover. But one of them, this one, caught my attention. He flipped it open and pointed to a line written 2 days before Leclerc's death. Rue des Martyrs, 10 p.m. The man with the yellow gloves will speak again. Lucas frowned. Yellow gloves? Maigret nodded. It's too precise to be random. He took his hat from the rack and motioned toward the door. Come, we'll take a walk to the Rue des Martyrs. The street, when they reached it, was alive with the muted hum of morning. The market stalls had begun to open, the scent of bread and roasting chestnuts mixing with the sharp tang of coal smoke. A tram rattled past, scattering pigeons into the air. The Rue des Martyrs sloped upward toward Montmartre, where the city began to thin into quieter corners. Maigret's eyes moved along the facades, bakeries, tailors, cafes with smudged windows, and then settled on a small establishment at the corner, Le Muguet Café. It was nearly empty inside. Only 2 old men sat near the back, reading newspapers, their cups of coffee untouched. The woman behind the counter, a stout figure with tired eyes, looked up as Maigret entered. "A coffee, if you please," he said, laying his hat on the counter. "And perhaps you can tell me, do you know a man who wears yellow gloves?" Her expression changed. A flicker, fear perhaps, or discomfort, crossed her face before she looked down at the counter. "I know many customers, Inspector, but none by that description." "Think carefully," Maigret said gently. "This man would stand out, tall, well-dressed, gloves bright as butter. He may have come here recently, perhaps late in the evening." She hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, he came, twice, maybe 3 times, always alone. Sat by the window there, ordered nothing but tea, never spoke to anyone." "Did he meet Monsieur Leclerc?" She bit her lip, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, about a week ago. They spoke quietly. When I went to clear their table later, the man in gloves was gone, and Monsieur Leclerc was trembling like a leaf." Maigret exchanged a glance with Lucas. "And you haven't seen him since?" "No," she said, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "But last night, someone else came asking about him. A foreigner. Dutch, maybe." "Van Dalen," Maigret muttered under his breath. "He's still here." They thanked the woman and left. Outside, the fog had thickened again, drifting down from the hill like a living thing. The sound of distant bells echoed faintly through the mist. Maigret drew his coat tighter. "He's circling us, Lucas, watching, testing how much we've seen." "And what exactly have we seen?" Lucas asked. "A frightened man, a phantom visitor, and a dead end." Maigret smiled grimly. "That's how most cases begin." By evening, the fog had swallowed the city whole. The lamps burned weak and yellow, their halos fading into nothing. Maigret walked alone along the boulevard de Rochechouart, his breath clouding in the cold air. The cobblestones glistened beneath his boots. Somewhere behind him a set of footsteps followed, steady, unhurried. He didn't turn immediately, he kept walking, listening. Then at the corner of Rue Frochot he stopped. The footsteps stopped too. He turned sharply. No one. The street was empty except for the faint outline of a carriage disappearing into the fog. He frowned, scanning the shadows, then continued on. But when he reached his apartment later, he found something waiting for him. A small, square envelope slipped beneath the door. The paper was damp from the night air, the handwriting neat and deliberate. It bore no address, only a single line. "Do not look for the man with yellow gloves. He will find you." Maigret stood for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. The faint scent of pipe tobacco lingered on the paper. The same brand Leclerc had smoked. He set it on the mantel beside his pipe and looked out the window at the fog that wrapped the city in silence. For the first time in many years, Inspector Maigret felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: unease. There were mysteries of crime, and there were mysteries of fate. This one, he thought, belonged to both. He sat down, lit his pipe, and whispered into the smoke, then let him come. The letter lay on Maigret's desk, like a small, silent threat. The ink had bled slightly from the dampness of the fog, but the words were still clear. "Do not look for the man with yellow gloves. He will find you." It was not a boast, it was a certainty. And Maigret, who had built a career on unravelling lies, felt the weight of that certainty more than he cared to admit. He arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres early, before the clerks or constables had begun their usual shuffle through the corridors. The silence suited him. He poured a small cup of bitter coffee from the percolator, sat down, and began reading through the reports again. Leclerc's life had been ordinary to the point of invisibility, yet his death had cast ripples across the city like a stone dropped into still water. Everywhere Maigret looked, the same pattern emerged: quiet men, unremarkable existences, and the sudden intrusion of something inexplicable. Lucas entered quietly, a rolled newspaper in his hand. "Morning, Chief. You should see this." He placed the paper on the desk, his finger tapping the headline. "Second body found near the Seine. No signs of foul play." Maigret took the paper, eyes narrowing. The victim was a clerk named Armand Pelletier, 41, unmarried, found sitting upright on a bench near Pont-Neuf. No marks of violence, no witnesses. The coroner's statement was almost identical to Leclerc's. Cardiac arrest, unexplained. But one line caught Maigret's attention. A pair of yellow gloves was discovered beside the body. He set the paper down slowly. "Lucas," he said, "we're not dealing with coincidence. Whoever this man is, he's leaving messages behind, calling cards." They went to the morgue later that morning. The place smelled of formalin and cold iron. The bodies rested beneath white sheets, still as statues. The coroner, a thin man with a weary face, greeted them with a nod. "No sign of poison, no bruising. Nothing unusual," he said, lifting the sheet just enough for Maigret to see the peaceful, almost serene expression on Pelletier's face. "What about the gloves?" "In his pocket?" "No. Found on the ground beside him, too large for his hands." "Then they were placed there," Maigret murmured. "Deliberately." As they stepped back into the courtyard, the morning fog began to thin, revealing the dull gleam of the Seine through the archway. Maigret lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly before the smoke curled into the damp air. 2 men dead, both calm, both forewarned, he said, and each touched by the same invisible hand. Lucas frowned. But why, Chief? What's the purpose? Maigret looked out toward the river. Perhaps it isn't about purpose. Perhaps it's about control. Later that day, he sat in a small cafe overlooking the water, his mind turning over every detail. The man with yellow gloves, was he an executioner or something else entirely? A manipulator who planted fear in his victims' hearts until their bodies simply gave up? The waiter refilled his cup, but Maigret barely noticed. A voice spoke softly from the table behind him. "Still chasing shadows, Inspector?" Maigret froze. He turned his head slightly and saw him, the same tall figure from the Hôtel Saint-Roch, the one who called himself Van Dalen. His black coat was immaculate, and on the table before him lay a pair of yellow gloves neatly folded. "You move quickly," Maigret said quietly. "I move where I am needed," Van Dalen replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "Though I suspect you would prefer to think of me as a criminal." Maigret studied him carefully. "You tell frightened men that death is coming, and then it does. What else should I think?" Van Dalen leaned back, unhurried. "Do you truly believe, Inspector, that I hold such power that by whispering a few words I can command the heart to stop beating?" "I believe fear can kill," Maigret said, "and you know how to plant it." "Fear is only a mirror," Van Dalen murmured. "I simply show men what already lives inside them." He slipped one glove onto his hand, flexing the fingers slowly. "Most of them thank me in the end." Maigret felt a strange chill creep through him. "Leclerc thanked you?" Van Dalen's expression softened. Leclerc was ready. He had been listening for years. "You, on the other hand?" He paused, his gaze sharpening. "You listen only to what can be written in reports and measured in blood." Maigret's jaw tightened. "And yet you leave corpses behind you." Van Dalen smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I only arrived to witness what was already decided." He stood, slipping the other glove into his pocket. "You should be careful, Inspector. Curiosity has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward the inevitable." Maigret rose as well, but when he stepped outside into the fog, Van Dalen was already gone. The street was empty except for a lone newspaper vendor whistling by the corner. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he replayed every word in his mind. Lucas and Janvier waited, uneasy at the sight of their chief pacing the room. "We can't charge him," Maigret said at last. "No evidence, no witnesses, nothing that would stand in court. But he's at the heart of this. I can feel it." "Then what do we do?" Janvier asked. "We wait," Maigret said simply. "The hand that guides him will show itself soon enough." That night, long after the others had gone, Maigret sat alone in his office. The fog had thickened again, pressing against the windows like breath. He reached for his pipe but found his hand trembling slightly. On the corner of the desk lay the folded note, still faintly smelling of tobacco. He whispered the words aloud. "Do not look for the man with yellow gloves. He will find you." And somewhere in the city, as the bells tolled midnight, Maigret felt certain that the man with yellow gloves had already begun to do just that. The following morning, the Seine was shrouded in a low mist that blurred the horizon into shades of pewter. The barges moved slowly along the water, their lanterns barely visible, as though they floated through some dreamlike world disconnected from time. Maigret stood by the window of his office, watching the slow drift of the fog. Behind him, the room buzzed with subdued energy, typewriters clacking, voices low, papers shuffling. Yet inside his mind there was silence. The conversation with Van Dalen lingered like smoke in his lungs. Every word the man had spoken seemed chosen with surgical precision, meant not only to inform but to disturb. Curiosity has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward the inevitable. The phrase replayed itself endlessly. Lucas entered, carrying a folder under his arm. "We traced the yellow gloves, Chief," he said, "a rare pair imported from Holland, sold in only one shop here in Paris, Rue Saint-Honoré, a small establishment called whodunit. The owner remembers selling 3 pairs last month, one to a banker, one to a woman from Bordeaux, and one to a tall foreign gentleman with a soft accent." "Dutch," Maigret said quietly. Lucas nodded. "Matches Van Dalen's description perfectly." Maigret tamped tobacco into his pipe, the smell of it filling the office. "And the banker?" "Alive and well," Lucas replied. "The woman too. No sign of fear in either of them." Maigret's eyes narrowed. "So only one of the 3 pairs carries death in its wake." He walked to his desk and opened Leclerc's notebook once more. The entries still unsettled him, the handwriting becoming more uneven as the days passed, the sentences shorter, desperate. But one note stood out now that he read it again with new eyes. The hand moves, unseen beneath the surface. "The rest are only reflections." "The rest are only reflections," Maigret murmured. He knew he was not alone. That afternoon, Maigret decided to visit Leclerc's old employer, a small accounting firm tucked away in a side street off Boulevard Sébastopol. The building was quiet, its facade streaked with grime. Inside, the stale air smelled of paper and ink. A clerk with round spectacles recognized the inspector at once. "Yes, I remember Leclerc," the man said. "A good worker, if a bit peculiar near the end. He kept talking about someone watching him, following him home from the office. I told him it was his nerves, but he insisted." "Did he ever mention a name?" Maigret asked. The clerk hesitated. "Only once. He said the man called himself Le Visiteur." Maigret exhaled slowly. "Did anyone else ever see this visitor?" "No," the clerk said, shaking his head. "But one evening, a letter arrived for him. No return address." He opened it, went pale, and left without a word. He never came back. When Maigret left the building, the air outside felt heavier, the fog pressing against him like a living thing. Le Visiteur. The name sounded more like a role than a man. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, a telegram was waiting for him. It had been sent from Le Havre. "Van Dalen not on any ship. Manifest stop. Possible. False name stop. Cool innkeeper recognizes description. Stop leaving this morning for Paris. Stop. Janvier." So the Dutchman had not fled after all. He was circling back. That night Maigret walked home later than usual. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the scent of rain. He crossed the Pont Neuf, his boots echoing on the stones, and paused midway to watch the water slide beneath him. The river, endless and indifferent, reflected the lights of the city in trembling ripples. He became aware of footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate. He turned, but the bridge was empty. Only the fog moved, coiling through the lamplight. When he reached his apartment, he found the door slightly ajar. His hand went to his revolver. He entered quietly, scanning the room. Everything seemed untouched, the table, the coat rack, the half-empty bottle of cognac. But then he saw it. A single yellow glove lying on the mantelpiece. He walked toward it slowly. It was the same shade as the others, but faintly stained at the fingertips with what looked like soot. He picked it up, turned it over, and found something pressed into the leather, a small card, blank except for one word written in fine black ink: "Observe." A knock came from the door, 3 slow raps. He crossed the room, revolver in hand, and opened it. No one stood there. Only the hallway stretched before him, empty and silent. Then, from somewhere below, a door slammed and footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Maigret ran after them, descending 2 flights, but by the time he reached the street, the fog had swallowed everything. He stood there for several minutes, the revolver heavy in his hand, before finally lowering it. Somewhere out there, the man with yellow gloves was watching, and now he knew Maigret was watching back. When he returned inside, he poured himself a measure of cognac and sat by the window. The city below was blurred, its sounds distant, its pulse faint. He thought again of Leclerc's words, of Pelletier, of the unseen current pulling them all toward some fixed point. The hand moves unseen beneath the surface. He began to wonder whether Van Dalen was the hand or merely one of its fingers. As the night deepened, the fog outside shifted like the restless turning of a dream. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang twice. Maigret's eyes drifted to the yellow glove on the mantel. It seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, as though it were watching him in return. He took a long draw on his pipe and said softly, almost to himself, "Beneath the surface, then. Let's see what truly lives there." And with that, he reached for his coat. The next morning would not wait. Paris had not woken fully when Maigret left his apartment. A light drizzle had begun again, fine as dust, softening the outlines of the city into something half-remembered. The cobblestones glistened, carriages rolled past like slow-moving beasts. Somewhere, a vendor shouted for early customers, his voice echoing across the nearly empty square. Maigret walked without haste, his hat pulled low, his thoughts heavier than the rain. He could not shake the image of the yellow glove on his mantle, nor the card that bore that single word, "Observe." It had not been a threat. It had been an instruction, perhaps even an invitation. Whoever had placed it there had been confident enough to step into the inspector's home and leave behind a signature as personal as a fingerprint. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier was already waiting. "The glove?" he asked, as Maigret entered. "Taken for analysis," Maigret said, though he doubted the lab would find anything. Leather, soot, handwriting from a fountain pen, the kind sold by the thousands, nothing unusual, nothing useful. Janvier nodded grimly. "And Van Dalen?" "Still in Paris," Maigret replied. "But he won't stay hidden long. Men like him enjoy being watched." He dropped his coat across the chair and leaned against the desk, staring at the window where droplets of rain traced uneven lines down the glass. "Lucas will continue at Rue des Martyrs. I want you to find every mention of a Le Visiteur in the old police files, anything from the last 20 years, murders, suicides, disappearances. I don't care if it sounds mad." Janvier hesitated, then nodded and left. For a long while, Maigret simply stood there. Outside, the river moved sluggishly, its grey waters thick with debris from the storm. He thought of Leclerc's fear, of Pelletier's stillness, of Van Dalen's voice. Smooth, deliberate, too calm for a man surrounded by death. There was a pattern, invisible but definite, winding through the streets like an underground current. By midday, Lucas returned with something unexpected. "Chief, I spoke to an old journalist from Le Petit Parisien. He swears he remembers a man by that same name, Le Visiteur. Said he wrote an article about him 15 years ago, a sort of urban myth." "An urban myth?" Maigret repeated. Lucas nodded. "A figure said to appear to people days before they die. Always described differently, but with one constant, the gloves, yellow, always yellow. Some called him a prophet, others a curse." Maigret said nothing for a moment. The ticking of the office clock filled the silence. Then he asked quietly, "And what did the journalist think?" He said he never believed it, until his editor died 2 days after meeting the man. The rest of the day passed in fragments, the sound of rain, the shuffle of papers, the slow approach of evening. The city outside seemed restless, as if aware of something stirring just beneath its surface. At dusk, Maigret took a carriage toward Montmartre. The streets, there always held a certain melancholy at night. The flicker of café lights, the faint strains of a violin from some distant window, the silhouettes of lovers and drunks passing beneath the same shadows. He stopped at Le Muguet Café, the place where Leclerc had last been seen. The woman behind the counter looked up, startled. "Back again, Inspector?" Maigret nodded. "You said the man in yellow gloves sat by the window. Did he leave anything behind? A glass? A paper? Anything at all?" She hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and produced a small object wrapped in cloth. "I kept this. He dropped it, I think. I was afraid to throw it away." Maigret unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a single brass key, old and slightly tarnished. A number was stamped along the top. 17. "Do you know what it opens?" She shook her head. "No, but the same night he was here, a man came after closing, asked if anyone had left a key. He was very polite. But I felt—" She trailed off, searching for the word. "Cold, that's the only way to describe it." Maigret thanked her and stepped back into the street. The fog had returned, heavier now, rolling in from the river. The city's lamps were dim halos in the mist. He turned the key over in his hand as he walked. Number 17. No address, no initials. It could open anything, or nothing. He decided not to return home. Instead, he took the key to the evidence room at the Quai des Orfèvres and locked it away. There was something about its weight that unsettled him, as though it carried more than metal. That night, he dreamed of Leclerc. The dead man stood at the foot of his bed, calm and almost peaceful, his lips forming words that Maigret could not hear. Behind him, Van Dalen's shadow stretched across the wall. Long, deliberate, inescapable. When Maigret awoke, the taste of pipe smoke lingered in his mouth, though he hadn't lit one in hours. The following day brought another letter. It arrived with the morning post, no return address, the same neat handwriting. Inside, a single line. "Every city has eyes, Inspector. Some are yours, some are mine." There was no signature. Maigret sat at his desk for a long time, reading the line over and over until the ink seemed to blur. For the first time in years, he wondered if the city itself was complicit, if the fog that hid men's faces also hid something else, a design, invisible but absolute. He folded the letter, placed it beside the glove on his desk, and muttered, "Then we'll see whose eyes are sharper." Outside, the bells of Notre Dame began to toll, their sound deep and resonant across the mist-laden air. Somewhere in the city, a man in yellow gloves was walking again. And Paris, ever watchful, ever hungry, was listening. The rain had returned by evening, falling in thin, silvery lines that shimmered under the street lamps. Paris had a way of seeming alive during rainstorms. The sound of carriage, wheels hissing through puddles, the faint glow of light escaping from cafe windows, the scent of wet stone and tobacco lingering in the air. Yet tonight, something about the city felt different. Watchful, expectant, Inspector Maigret walked the narrow corridor of the Quai des Orfèvres, his heavy steps echoing faintly against the worn tile floor. A telegram awaited him on his desk, creased and smudged from hurried handling. He opened it, and as his eyes skimmed the lines, a quiet chill ran through him. Second body found at Saint-Ouen. Same signs, same time of death as others. Yellow gloves present. It was signed by Lucas. The inspector took his coat and hat without a word and stepped out into the rain once more. The scene at Saint-Ouen was desolate, a half-abandoned warehouse near the freight yards, its walls damp and peeling, its windows black with grime. The body lay slumped near a rusted oil drum, rain pooling around his feet. Another ordinary man, a warehouse bookkeeper named Michel Duret. No wounds, no struggle, the same expression of faint astonishment frozen on his features. Lucas met Maigret by the doorway, his coat soaked through. "Found him about an hour ago," he said. Workers noticed the light was still on and came to check. No one saw or heard anything unusual. "And the gloves?" Maigret asked. Lucas nodded toward the body. "One pair, placed neatly in his lap this time." Maigret crouched, studying the detail. The gloves gleamed faintly in the lamplight, their yellow leather glistening with rain. Beneath them was something else, a folded scrap of paper. He lifted it carefully with the tip of his penknife. Only one word was written there: witness. The inspector straightened slowly, the cold sinking into his bones. "He's escalating," he murmured. Lucas frowned. "Escalating. Before he watched. Now he performs." They searched the warehouse, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Only the faint drip of water through a hole in the roof, echoing like a metronome. Yet as Maigret stood in the center of that empty space, he had the distinct sensation of being observed. Somewhere, someone was enjoying the view. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, it was past midnight. The corridors were silent, except for the hum of the gas lights. He poured himself a measure of brandy and sat down heavily. The word witness lay before him like a question with no answer. Was Van Dalen the hand or only the messenger? He thought again of that quiet, measured voice in the café. "I simply show men what already lives inside them." What if that was true? What if these men had not been murdered in the traditional sense, but led, carefully, deliberately, to their own deaths? At dawn, Janvier arrived with new findings. "Chief, I checked Leclerc's bank records. He withdrew a large sum the day before his death. Nearly everything he had. And Duret did the same. Both took out the same amount, 2,000 francs. Maigret looked up sharply. "And where did it go?" "No trace," Janvier said. "Not in deposits, not in debts. It just vanished." Maigret rubbed his temples. "A transaction without a recipient," he muttered. "A payment to nowhere." Then an idea struck him. What if the payment wasn't financial? Janvier blinked. "You mean blackmail?" "Not exactly," Maigret said. "More like a toll. Something they believed they had to pay." He stood and walked to the window, where the fog outside glowed faintly in the dawn light. 3 deaths, 3 warnings, all men convinced their fate was sealed. And each one had contact with the same stranger, a man who calls himself an observer. Lucas entered then, his expression grim. "Chief, there's more. A clerk at the Hôtel Saint-Roch says Van Dalen returned last night, booked the same room, asked for it by number." Maigret's pulse quickened. "Did he leave again?" "Not yet. He's still there." Maigret reached for his coat. "Then it's time he and I spoke again." The Hôtel Saint-Roch looked even smaller in daylight, its ivy-covered facade glistening with moisture. Inside, the same nervous clerk stood behind the counter, his hands fidgeting with the room keys. "Yes, Monsieur Van Dalen is upstairs," he whispered. But he asked not to be disturbed. Maigret smiled faintly. "I'll make an exception." He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath his weight. At the top, he paused before room 14. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, he heard it, the sound of someone speaking softly, almost chanting. He knocked once. No answer. He opened the door. The room was empty. The windows stood open, the curtains billowing inward with the wind. On the table lay a single yellow glove and a small envelope. Maigret crossed the room, heart pounding, and opened it. Inside was a photograph, Etienne Leclerc, seated in his armchair, eyes closed, moments before death. On the back, a handwritten note, "You are looking in the wrong direction." Maigret turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. Only the faint smell of pipe smoke lingered. His own brand. He left the hotel and stepped into the pale morning light. For the first time, he felt not the thrill of pursuit, but the unease of being pursued. Somewhere in the crowd, Van Dalen, or whoever wore his shape, was watching. As he crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the slow churn of the river below. The city was waking again, unaware of the quiet duel taking place within its veins. And Maigret, pipe unlit, muttered under his breath, "Then show me, my friend." "Show me the direction I've missed." The bells of Notre Dame answered, deep and unyielding, as though the city itself approved the challenge. By the next morning, the city had taken on that strange stillness that precedes a storm. The air itself felt heavier, and even the pigeons on the rooftops seemed to sense something in the shifting light. Maigret had slept little. His pipe had burned to its stem twice in the night, and each time he had found himself staring at the same objects on his desk: the yellow glove, the card that said "Observe," and the photograph of Etienne Leclerc. The words, "You are looking in the wrong direction," had played over and over in his mind, circling him like the fog outside his window. What direction, then, was right? At 8:30, Janvier entered, looking pale from lack of sleep. "Chief, we have something new. You told us to dig into the files connected to Leclerc's old firm. I think you were right about the money." Maigret looked up. "Go on." "Those withdrawals, 2,000 francs each, they weren't random. They all passed through a small provincial bank in Orléans. The same intermediary signature appears on each account. A company called La Société d'Études Métaphysiques, registered 5 months ago. No physical address, no employees, only a postbox." Maigret rose from his chair. "And the signature?" Janvier handed him a photocopy. "H. Van Dalen." The inspector let out a slow breath. "So that's it," he murmured. "They all paid the same man for the same promise." Lucas entered just then, rain dripping from his hat. "Chief, there's more. The journalist who wrote that old story about Le Visiteur, he's alive, name's Moret, lives in a small apartment near Montparnasse, says he's been expecting you." "Expecting me?" Maigret asked. Lucas nodded uneasily. His words, not mine. By the time Maigret reached the address, the drizzle had turned to steady rain. The building was ancient, its courtyard choked with ivy and the faint smell of mildew. He climbed the stairs slowly, every creak sounding louder than it should. The door to Moret's apartment was ajar. He pushed it open and called out softly, "Monsieur Moret?" Inside, the air was stale, the curtains drawn, papers littered the table, half burned in an ashtray. On the wall, pinned by a rusted tack, was a newspaper clipping from Le Petit Parisien. "The man who comes before death." Beneath it, written in a trembling hand, was a note. "He's here again." Maigret moved further in. The journalist sat slumped at the table, a pen still between his fingers. His face was calm, his eyes half open, the same expression of quiet astonishment. And beside him, as if placed in ritual, lay a single yellow glove. For a long time, Maigret did not move. The sound of rain against the window filled the silence. It was not shock he felt, but a weary confirmation. The pattern had completed itself. The circle closed. Then he saw it. Something that didn't fit. On the table, beneath the journalist's hand, was a notebook, its final page torn halfway through. The last entry read, "I met him again. He said the inspector would come. Said we were both part of the same story." The same story. Maigret's hands tightened around the page. Outside, Lucas and Janvier were waiting. "Another one?" Lucas asked quietly. "Yes," Maigret said, but this time he left a message. He looked down the rain-slick street, the lamps blurring in the mist. "He wants me to find him." That evening, Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres and shut himself in his office. He spread the case files across the desk. Leclerc, Pelletier, Duret, and now Moret. 4 men, unconnected except for fear. Each had seen Van Dalen, each had paid him something, and each had died with the same look on their face, as if death had come to them not by force, but by persuasion. He stared at the map of Paris on the wall. A red pin marked each location: Rue du Temple, Pont-Neuf, Saint-Ouen, Montparnasse. He stood back, tracing the points with his eyes. Together they formed a rough semicircle around the heart of the city, converging on a single point, the Ile de la Cité, the old island, the true heart of Paris. He turned off the lamp, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the night. The Seine was dark beneath the bridges, reflecting only the faintest glimmer of the gaslights. The streets were almost deserted. Maigret crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, his boots striking the wet stones, and made his way toward the narrow lanes that twisted behind Notre Dame. It was there, in a forgotten square, that he found it. A small, unmarked door beneath a flickering lamp. The name on the brass plate had been polished clean: La Société d'études métaphysiques. He pushed the door open. The air inside smelled of old paper and candle wax. The walls were lined with shelves of books, their spines marked in Latin, Dutch, and French. In the center of the room stood a single desk, and behind it, as though he had been waiting all along, sat Van Dalen. "Inspector," he said softly, "you took longer than I expected." Maigret closed the door behind him. "You've killed 4 men. Van Dalen shook his head. "I have killed no one. I only reveal the moment that already belongs to them." "You're a manipulator," Maigret said, "a charlatan who convinces men they are doomed until they make it true." "Perhaps," Van Dalen replied, "but you came here knowing I would be. Why, then, do you seek me if you do not already believe?" Maigret's hand twitched near his coat pocket. "Because I want the truth." Van Dalen leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "The truth, Inspector, is that every man carries his own death within him. Some of us simply choose to look." He reached for a drawer, pulled something out, and placed it on the desk. A small mirror, old and mottled with age. "Look, Maigret. Tell me what you see." The inspector hesitated, then leaned closer. The reflection was faint, blurred by the grime on the glass. But behind his own tired eyes he thought he saw movement. A second figure standing just behind him in the shadows. He turned sharply. No one was there. When he looked back, Van Dalen was gone. Only the yellow gloves remained, folded neatly beside the mirror. The city bells began to toll in the distance, low and resonant, echoing across the Seine. Maigret stood there alone in that dim room, the fog pressing against the windows, and for the first time he felt the weight of the word that had followed him from the beginning. Not as a warning, but as a prophecy. Observe. The hand had moved, the pattern was complete. And somewhere beyond the fog, the unseen watcher waited for his next subject. When morning came, the city was still wrapped in mist. The sky hung low, dull and colourless, and the sound of the bells from Notre Dame drifted faintly across the Seine like the heartbeat of something ancient and indifferent. Maigret hadn't slept. He sat by the window of his small apartment, the mirror Van Dalen had left resting on the table before him. The glass was cloudy, cracked at the edge, yet when he caught his reflection in it, he felt as though he was staring at a stranger. There was a knock on the door. Lucas entered quietly, his hat in his hand. "Chief," he said, "the office is in a state. Everyone's talking. The papers got wind of the story. They're calling him Le Prophète de la Mort." Maigret's eyes stayed on the mirror. "A prophet needs believers," he murmured, "and Paris is full of those." Lucas hesitated. "We found something else at the Société's office after you left. Hidden compartment in the floorboards. Dozens of files, names, dates, all written in the same hand, most of them crossed out, all except one." He placed a sheet of paper on the table. A single name remained uncrossed: Jules-Aimé Maigret. The inspector stared at it for a long moment. Then he exhaled softly through his nose and reached for his pipe. "It seems I've joined the congregation." "Chief, this isn't funny." "I'm not laughing," Maigret interrupted. His tone was quiet, steady, but his eyes had darkened. "Tell Janvier to lock up those files, and keep Van Dalen's name out of the newspapers. If he wants me, he won't need the headlines to find me." When Lucas left, the apartment felt heavier than before. Maigret poured a measure of cognac, watching the amber liquid tremble in the glass. The city outside had turned to shadow and noise, the streets alive with the endless rhythm of life, unaware of what moved beneath it. He could feel it now, that slow, unseen current he had sensed from the beginning. Something was drawing him toward a final point, as inevitable as the tide. By evening, the fog thickened again. The lamp on his desk flickered as though struggling to stay alive. He opened the window for air, and at once the smell of rain and river drifted in. That was when he heard it. Footsteps on the stair outside. Slow, measured, unhurried. He stood, his heart pounding. The steps reached his door and stopped. A single knock. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and Van Dalen stepped inside. The Dutchman looked unchanged, composed, immaculate, his gloves bright even in the dim light. He closed the door softly behind him and regarded Maigret with something almost like pity. "You've done well, Inspector," he said. "You followed the line to its end." Maigret gestured toward the chair opposite. "Then sit and explain why it ends with me." Van Dalen smiled faintly. "Because you've seen too much. You began by watching others die, and now you've become part of the story. That's the way of all observers." "I'm not part of your story," Maigret said. "Then why are you still holding the mirror?" Maigret looked down. He hadn't realized until now that the small mirror still rested in his hand. The surface shimmered faintly in the lamplight, and for a fleeting instant he thought he saw movement again, the same figure standing behind him, closer now. He set it down carefully. "You play with people's minds, Van Dalen. You make them believe they're doomed until their hearts stop from fear." "Fear?" Van Dalen tilted his head. "No, Inspector, I only tell them the truth. They come to me because they already sense it. I give them permission to stop pretending." "You call that truth?" "I call it mercy." For a moment neither spoke. The rain pattered against the window, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed suddenly very loud. Then Maigret said, "You think you can decide when a man's story ends, but you've forgotten something." Van Dalen raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" "That I don't believe in prophets," Maigret said, and drew his revolver. The Dutchman did not flinch. He simply looked at the weapon, then back at Maigret. "And yet you're holding that gun because you believe I have already written your death. Do you see, Inspector? You've already given me what I need." The words settled in the air like a fog of their own. Maigret's hand trembled slightly, but he kept the revolver steady. "You won't leave this room," he said. Van Dalen's gaze softened. "No, I suppose I won't." He removed his gloves, placed them neatly on the table, and said quietly, "The difference between us, Maigret, is that I have made peace with what's coming." Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile, and whispered, "Observe." The lights flickered once and went out. When Maigret relit the lamp seconds later, the chair across from him was empty. The gloves remained, but Van Dalen had vanished, as if swallowed by the dark. He stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then he sat down, reached for his pipe, and found his hands were shaking. He forced himself to breathe. The revolver lay on the table beside the gloves. At that moment, Lucas burst through the door, breathless. "Chief, we found him!" "Van Dalen's body?" He stopped short, seeing the look on Maigret's face. "Where?" Maigret asked. "In a room near the Ile de la Cité, shot in the chest, dead at least an hour." Maigret looked slowly toward the gloves on his desk. The smell of pipe smoke hung in the air, though he hadn't lit one since the lights went out. He rose, walked to the window, and stared out at the river. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of Notre Dame. Below, the water glimmered darkly, carrying the reflection of the city's lights like scattered fragments of some larger truth. "Chief?" Lucas asked quietly. Maigret didn't turn. "Tell them to close the case," he said. "File it under natural causes." Lucas hesitated. "But that's an order." When the younger man left, Maigret remained by the window, listening to the soft hum of the river below. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled once, then again. He reached into his pocket and drew out the small mirror. For a moment it reflected nothing but the dull glow of the lamp. Then, slowly, faintly, another face appeared beside his own. Calm, expressionless, wearing yellow gloves. He set the mirror down, extinguished the lamp, and let the darkness claim the room. Outside, Paris breathed, vast, eternal, unfeeling. And beneath it all, the unseen hand continued its work, guiding each life toward its appointed hour. And in that silence, only Maigret's voice remained, low and steady. "Some mysteries don't end, Lucas. They simply change their observer."